Well, thank you very much for including us today. And good morning from a very foggy Indian summer here in Washington, D.C. I thought we'd just start right off with what the research that we've recently concluded, and we focused in on here as appropriate for how we do elections here in the United States on what we considered a handful of battleground states, four or five, which are well-established toss-ups, and then a couple which we thought were interesting based on recent trends. So the research we're going to show you today was conducted toward the end of September through the beginning of February, so a period covering everything from the announcement around Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice, the first presidential debate, and the president's illness. So, it's a snapshot in time, but we think it was an important time that did impact voters' minds. The states that we looked at were Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas. And please do let us know if you have any questions at the end of this regarding either our methodology or some of the results that we're going to be talking about today. We broke our voters down into four categories. Obviously, Trump supporters, Biden supporters, swing voters, those people who are undecided about who to vote for or likely to change their mind before election. And then Trump defectors, who we find very interesting, those people who voted for the president in 2016, but are currently intending to vote for somebody else. And as you can see here, the Trump defectors make up 5% of the electorate, and the swing voters are still hovering between 12 to 14%. We thought we'd start right off on the big compelling issue of the day here in the United States, in London and the UK more generally, and obviously globally. And it has to do with the coronavirus. It is the compelling issue of the 2020 presidential race. And the first question we want to go through with you is the president's handling of the coronavirus and whether it made people force people to reconsider their support for him. The thing I'd like to drill right down into quickly for you all is take a look at the first set of colors there and look at the black. So 56% of Trump defectors are going to vote for Vice President Biden or someone else based purely on the president's handling of the coronavirus. It's absolutely extraordinary there. And again, it's a theme we saw throughout our research. In various categories, but that just jumps right out there that again, this categorization of the president's failure to properly handle the pandemic has led not only obviously to the Biden supporters will support Biden, the Trump supporters will support Trump, but it has really that 5% has been driven by the president's handling or mismanagement of the coronavirus. What we also found is that this race on both the positive and the negative has all to do with President Trump. I don't think Joe Biden is a great candidate, but I'll do anything to get rid of Donald Trump. And so we've summed this up by Trump is polarizing and Biden is uninspiring. It's again, through some of the details, which we'll go through in a minute, you'll see this, but this, you're either for President Trump or you're against President Trump. And it is that black and white as we've seen this throughout all of our research. And obviously the campaigns reflect this as well. And again, you'll see that same thing here about voting motivations. This is a very motivated electorate, which we'll come to in a minute, that the voting for the president, voting against the president is the compelling motivation here, or versus a particular party or a particular issue. And obviously, I'm sorry for going through this quickly. I just want to make sure we cover a good amount of material and happy to take any questions. As you all know, by this point in time, we run our elections based on the Electoral College. We don't directly elect our presidents. I sent in my mail-in ballot yesterday, and obviously I'm selecting an elector who will represent me here in the District of Columbia. But we have clear, safe Republican states, safe Democratic states, and then the battleground states. And I was telling somebody the other day that I don't think I've seen a single ad for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump on local television here, because either the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia are so clearly defined as, in this case, safe Democrats. No one's investing any time or money here in our area. So let's to me, one of the most important things in this election is what's distinguishing it is voter motivation. We had a highly motivated electorate in 2004 in the middle of the second Gulf War. And we saw numbers similar to this in terms of voter turnout and voter motivation first and voter turnout. It dipped a bit going into 2008, even, you know, with the historic election of Barack Obama as our first African-American president. And then it just dipped in 2016, down around 50-something%. But we're seeing in this election a very, very motivated electorate. And the question now becomes, does it translate into voter turnout? With regard to awareness of campaign messages, as you can see here, and it's not a surprise for both campaigns and their supporters, the messages around the coronavirus and the pandemic are the drivers here. But we do have other issues that affect both camps. For example, the president's, the Supreme Court nomination of Amy Coney Barrett has energized the president's base. He's used it to remind his supporters of campaign promises he made going back to 2016 about bringing the courts back to a conservative leaning. He's obviously been successful on that, both in the lower courts and certainly in an unprecedented way in the Supreme Court. But also then the economy is a big issue for the president, and one which poll after poll shows it's a winner for him. For Joe Biden, again, it's all things coronavirus. But he has always held a lead in polling, and our research has shown that amongst both his supporters and swing voters and Trump defectors about issues on social issues such as racial injustice, obviously, which came to the fore this summer with the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests around the U.S. And then slightly separate from coronavirus is healthcare, with the Obamacare legislation always being contentious, and certainly now with a Supreme Court case pending that might overturn the legislation passed now 8 years ago, impacting, you know, potentially 20 million Americans who might not have healthcare. One of the more interesting things I think that came out of our research was the cutting through various campaign slogans. What you can see here is going all the way back to 2016, the clarity and the resonance of the president's message, first making America great again and now keeping America great, is something which is quite extraordinary. It's well established in its simplicity, and he does a phenomenal job in hanging almost everything that he does off of these key messages. I wasn't surprised by the Biden campaign slogans and the lack of traction that they get. One might argue that with 2 weeks to go, this could be a potential disaster for Biden. But I think their own research and discussions with Biden campaign people is showing is that they're basing everything on the fact that Joe Biden is not Donald Trump, and they're playing on Donald Trump's strong negatives as their own messaging. The motivation for Biden voters is because he's not Donald Trump. In fact, the yard signs around at least my neighborhood in Washington are very whimsical, that spell out the name Biden, B-Y-E-D-O-N, as in Biden. And so there, again, we see everywhere we turn in our research that this is a campaign about Donald Trump. You're for Donald Trump or you're against Donald Trump. Now we just have to see when it comes to voter turnout, the support as this translates from a referendum on the president to a vote for Joe Biden if you're a Biden supporter. Lizzie, I'll turn this over to you to dive a little bit into the research.
Great, thanks, Larry. So I know the question on everyone's minds at this point is who's ahead, who's going to win, and we're not going to be focusing on simply who's ahead in the polls because you've got plenty of other public polls that you can look to for that data. What we're going to be focusing in on is at this point, who is still undecided? What do they look like? And what issues do they care about? What's going to motivate them to the polls on the 3rd? Ultimately, what we want you to be able to do is to go away and assess for yourself, watching the campaigns over the next couple of weeks, who's actually putting themselves in the best position for a win, given what you've heard today. So let's take a look at the state of the race. Voters' expectations about the outcome remain very divided. We asked respondents what they think will be the outcome of the next election. And as you can see, their perceptions about who is going to be the president, elected the president after the 3rd, are very much divided or split. As many of you know, this is very different to the state of expectations prior to the 2016 election, before which most voters were expecting some sort of decisive Clinton victory. Obviously, expectations of a big victory always risks making voters lazy or complacent as they lose the urgency to vote. And in fact, we saw Joe Biden's campaign manager come out over the weekend with a public warning to Biden supporters about becoming too complacent, in which she called Biden's national vote lead inflated. Now, what she's trying to do here is to really taper voter expectations to keep Biden's support base motivated to head to the polls on election day. And really, it's a warning she's right to give, because as Larry showed right at the very start, 14% of our sample are still likely to change their minds. They're undecided about who to vote for. So Trump's going to want to retain every single voter that he can who supported him in 2016. So let's take a look at how he's doing with that. This top bar here shows how 2016 Trump voters are currently intending to vote in 2020. Now, as you can see, 87% of 2016 Trump voters are intending to vote for Trump again this year, but you can also see that he's losing 11% to the Democrats. And even though he's picking up 5% of Clinton voters in 2016, that's still leaving him with a net deficit of 6% that's going from red to blue. So one of the first questions that we want to answer is, who are these Trump defectors? What do they look like? And what do they care about? This is the profile of Trump defectors from the data that we've collected. And what we're seeing is that they're more male, they're more white, and most don't have a university degree. Now, if that profile sounds familiar to anyone, it's because it's very similar to Trump's base of supporters in 2016, who for the large part were white, working class males without a degree. So this demographic profile actually suggests that Trump is losing part of what would have been considered his core support base at the last election. What issues do they care about? They care about COVID, healthcare, the economy and jobs. And clearly, if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, they've been left unimpressed with Trump's handling of both COVID and the economy, because as you can see, they believe that Biden is best to handle both of those things. So these are the defectors who the Trump campaign are desperately going to be trying to win back in 14 days' time. So there's one other voter group that we need to take a look at, and that is the swing voter group. Remember, these are the people who say that they could still change their minds about who to vote for before the election. The top bar shows how these swing voters are currently planning to vote. I'll call out that 48%, nearly half of them, are leaning towards Biden at this point, with 13% still completely undecided. But really the interesting thing is, if we examine how this group of swing voters voted in 2016, we can see that fully a quarter of them just couldn't vote for either Trump or Clinton. They voted for another candidate, or they just didn't vote at all. So, of course, we know that at this point, 4 years ago, Clinton was a lot more divisive a character than Biden is today. She had a net favorability that is much lower than Biden is today. So there is definitely a sense that at least some of these swing voters are tentatively returning home to a Democratic Party that they just couldn't support last time around. So what do the swing voters look like? This is their profile. They're younger, they tend to be in work. The issues most important in determining if and how they vote: same issues: COVID, healthcare, the economy, and job. And spoiler alert, no matter what kind of voter group you're looking at, these 4 issues tend to top the list. The majority of them support things like the fight against climate change, universal healthcare, legalization of marijuana. If you think these people sound like Democratic Party supporters, you'd be right. They care about all of the same things. So why are they still likely to change their minds before the 3rd? You've got it right there on the right-hand side of your screen. An absolute majority of them don't yet prefer Biden, or don't yet want Biden to become president after the next election, or they're not sold. You've got 36% who say they'd still prefer Trump, and you've got 17% saying they haven't been persuaded either way. So I would expect that if the Biden campaign were to see this, they'd be desperately trying to harden up these swing voters by demonstrating that Biden is the right candidate for the right moment, especially so that these voters don't end up changing their minds before Election Day. So we've looked at the important voter groups. Now let's take a look at issues and how they relate to each candidate. Now, this slide shows us the issues and attributes that more voters associate with Trump over Biden, as you can see by the net scores there in the brackets next to each line. As you can see, the things at the top of the list that Trump has the greatest net lead over Biden on are all the attributes and characteristics rather than issues. So our attention-seeking, sexist, racist. I don't think it's particularly surprising to see these near the top of Trump's list, especially when we consider that this is a choice between Trump or Biden. But the real question that we want to ask ourselves is, do any of these actively drive opposition to Trump? And that is a question we'll come to answer in a couple of slides. I actually think the thing that you should be most interested in is right at the very bottom of this list. We can see that Trump has a really negligible 2% lead over Biden on our best to manage the economy, a 3% lead on our best for protecting and creating jobs. At this point in the race, you really would have expected the Trump campaign to have a far greater lead when it comes to matters of the economy and employment, especially over Biden, and especially given the strength of the US's economy up until the pandemic hit. What this data shows is that the Trump campaign has really let ownership of the economy slip. And now, essentially, it's anyone's to play for, which is very worrying for Trump indeed. So let's have a look at the issues and attributes that are associated with Biden. Immediately, if you look to the middle of this list, you can see that Biden has a net 12 percentage point lead on is best to tackle the coronavirus pandemic, which is really the issue of the day. Again, I don't think this is particularly surprising given the number of polls that have shown that on the whole, Americans are pretty dissatisfied with Trump's handling of the pandemic. And surely it's a huge asset to the Biden campaign at this late stage to know that they have a solid lead on this. If you cast your eyes up towards the top of the list, look at the figures for R2 progressive and R2 old. Now, these are the two main Trump charges against Biden. And even though Biden's got a net lead on them, look at the color of the bars. At least half of our sample don't attribute either R2 old or R2 progressive specifically to Biden, and instead fall into this murky gray area of saying like neither, like both, don't know. It's really a sign that Trump's two main attacks on Biden are not being as effective as his campaign would like at this stage in the race. And if you look down at the bottom, you can even see that Trump's let some of these issues to do with fiscal prudence kind of creep onto Biden's slide. Have the right tax policies will pay down the federal budget deficit. But really, I think the most shocking thing about this slide is to see that Biden actually has a 4-point net lead on will stay true to their promises. Remember, Trump was the candidate a year ago that everyone thought would win re-election easily just because of how many promises he's carried through with over the last 4 years of his presidency. He's cut corporate tax rate, he's building the wall, he's increased national defense spend year on year, he's pulled out of the Paris climate change, he's pulled out of TPP. There's so many more. The fact that his campaign hasn't done more to highlight everything that he's done over the last 4 years and all the promises that he's followed through on is really a critical mistake in my view, and something that could end up costing him dearly if he doesn't change tack in the last 2 weeks before Election Day. So it's all well and good looking at what voters associate with each candidate, but the remaining question is what is actually associated or driving vote at this stage in the race. Now, what we use to determine that is a technique called regression analysis, which I'm sure many of you have heard of or perhaps used yourself. It's used to measure the relationship between one dependent variable and lots of independent variables, which are the points that you can see on this chart. Here we've used it to figure out what is currently associated with voting for either candidate among soft voters, those who are undecided or likely to change their minds. And the way that you read this graph is that the further along the x-axis in either direction you go, the more a point is associated with a particular candidate. And the higher up or down the y-axis you go, the more associated that point is with either a vote for or a vote against that particular candidate. Now, from a campaigner's perspective, the easiest way to interpret this graph is by quadrant. So if you look at the top right-hand quadrant, you can see that the strongest associated factor with a positive vote for Trump is actually the man himself. At the same time, you can see various attributes that we put a box around in the bottom right-hand quadrant that are associated with a negative vote against Trump. Again, all things to do with Trump himself. We know just how polarized the electorate is, and this really shows that Trump has a really delicate balancing act to do in terms of motivating these voters to come out in support of him, whilst also not alienating them with some of his more controversial or divisive characteristics and attributes. Now, if you look at the top left-hand quadrant, you can see that the strongest association with a positive vote for Biden is again the individual himself, although notice how much lower down the chart he is than Trump. This reflects something I highlighted earlier, which is that a really healthy portion of these softer swing voters are still undecided about who would make the best president. And we can see the admission there in the center of the chart. I don't think Joe Biden is a great candidate, but I'll do anything to get rid of Donald Trump. Trump is not only positively associated with a vote for himself, he's also positively associated with a vote for Biden, which at 14 days out from the election is going to be a very tough issue to mitigate indeed. There are a couple of other things that I think are worthy of calling out just before I wrap up. The first is that two of the most important issues that will determine if and how these voters decide to vote, healthcare and COVID, are currently positively associated with the vote for Biden. Of course, as Larry's already covered, COVID is the issue that most voters have heard the campaigns talking about, which really seems to have worked to Biden's advantage thus far. But it's not all good news for the Biden campaign, because you can see down in the bottom left-hand quadrant there, vote associated, an attribute associated negatively with Biden is, I'm worried about the liberal woke agenda that the Democrats are advocating, which paints a really poignant contrast with the other point that I've highlighted up in the top right-hand corner. Donald Trump may be controversial, but he says what the majority of us are thinking. If I were the Trump campaign and I saw this, I would try and play on those fears and warn voters of the Liberals' woke agenda as much as I could before November 3rd. If I were the Biden campaign, I would be very careful in what sort of legislative agenda I would be choosing to push over the next 4 years to make sure that he doesn't alienate too many of these voters who are sitting on the fence with the agenda that he follows through on. So that's it for the data. I will leave you with this slide. Given what Larry and I have taken you through today, I think that the markers that you're going to need to be looking for a successful campaign in the last 2 weeks prior to Election Day are, for the Biden campaign, continuing their focus on COVID as well as healthcare, really attacking Trump for his handling of the pandemic thus far. They're also going to be wanting to persuade people currently on the fence about Biden that his attributes such as honesty, trustworthiness, accountability make him the right candidate for the moment, and really contrasting this to the more unsavory aspects of Trump's character and how detrimental they'll be to another 4 years in office. And on the Trump campaign side, I think that a successful Trump campaign in the last 2 weeks really has to center on refocusing on the economy and jobs, making sure that he's reframing his COVID response in light of the economy and his plan for stimulus provision. Also highlighting all of his promises that he's kept over the last 4 years to try and reach back out to as many of his 2016 voters as possible. And of course, warning of the Liberals' woke agenda and how it will put America at danger of being crippled yet again.